Chapter 9 finishes up the flow of food, and we get to the most important part where our customers get to enjoy that product, and that comes to the service part of the flow of food. Chapter 9, we're going to talk about time temperature requirements for holding hot and cold TCS foods. We're going to look at ways to prevent time temperature abuse and cross-contamination when we display and serve that food. We're going to look at requirements of using time rather than temperature as the only method of control when holding TCS foods. We're going to look at ways of minimizing bare hand contact with ready-to-eat food. We're going to look at how we prevent staff from contaminating food during service, how to prevent guests from contaminating self-service areas, hazards of transporting food and ways of preventing those hazards, hazards of serving food off-site and how we can prevent those as well, and hazards of vending food and ways that we can prevent those hazards as well. So when it comes to holding, I've said this before, keep hot food hot, keep cold food cold, right? So if you're holding hot food, the internal temperature of that food needs to be at 135 or greater. If you're holding cold food, the internal temperature needs to be at 41 or lower. And the only way you can accurately find that out is to use a calibrated thermometer, okay? Then it says never use temperature gauge on a holding unit to check the food's temperature. That temperature gauge does not tell you what the food's at. It tells you what the cabinet is at. It tells you what that holding unit is at. It doesn't tell you the internal temperature of the food. You have to use a thermometer in order to accurately tell what your food is actually being held at as far as those temperatures that need to be done. So first and foremost, if we're holding food, we need to make sure that we're monitoring the temperatures regularly. We need to check temperatures at least every 4 hours, making sure that we're throwing out food not at 41 or lower, or 135 or higher if it's supposed to be hot. Another thing you can do is check temperatures every 2 hours, and that leaves time for corrective action if it falls within the temperature danger zone. So if you check every 4 hours and you find that something is above 41 or it's below 135, you got to pitch it. If you check every 2 hours and you find that the food is above 41 or below 135, you've got time to correct it and get it back into the right zone to make sure you don't have to throw that food away. But that means you do then have to check your food more often to make sure that you're good as far as the timing, so you can take advantage of that time temperature principle. So if you're reheating food, and I talked about this in chapter 8, but you want to make sure that you are using equipment that will rapidly reheat food, and hot holding equipment is not used for that. You know, I use the crock pot as an example. Well, another example in a commercial kitchen is a holding cabinet. And they're meant, once you cook the food, it just is a place to throw sheet pans or pans into that hot holding unit to keep the food at 135 or above. It's not meant to reheat the food, because it's not going to get it up to 165 within the 2 hours, because it doesn't get that hot. In fact, it doesn't make sense for it to get that hot, because then it wouldn't be holding food, it'd be cooking food. Okay? So you want to reheat that food correctly, then move it over to the holding unit to let it do its job. Food covers and sneeze guards. You want to make sure that you're covering food and install sneeze guards to protect from contaminants. The covers protect food from contamination, and also it helps to maintain food temperatures. So you see, as far as the soup tureens there, they have the lids on them. Yes, it prevents, crud from getting into them that shouldn't, but it also helps to maintain that soup at the right temperature, because you don't have the cooler air coming in and potentially cooling down the soup itself. Okay? As far as holding foods, you need to create policies about how long the food is held and then when it will be thrown out. Obviously, you want to make sure that the policies are at or greater than health department standards. So you can be more strict than the health department, but you can't be less strict than the health department. All right. So, you take that into consideration, but your kitchen's policies, which should be in writing, you'll hear that a lot from me when you take management with me, but those policies should be in black and white and make sure that you're following to them, but they have to be created if they're not already created at your place of business. So how do you hold food without temperature control? So you do have this option. Now you got to talk to, now I'm going to make a caveat here. You need to talk to your county health department because there are certain circumstances where they will allow it. There are certain circumstances where they will not allow it. So you need to make sure that if you're going to use time as a control, that you understand what your county health department allows and what they don't allow. So holding food without temperature control. You can hold ready to eat TCS foods without temperature control for up to 6 hours. Okay. So you can have it out on the counter, or what have you, up to 6 hours. However, okay, it first has to be held at 41 or below before removing it from the refrigerator. So when you get ready to remove it from the refrigerator, you have to make sure it temps out at 41 or below. Okay. It does not exceed 70 degrees internal temperature during service. Okay. So you can have it out and you can use time as a control, but you have to make sure that when you are checking the temperature, that the internal temperature does not go above 70. Once it goes above 70, you've got to throw out that food because it's exceeded that temperature area. The other thing the health department's going to require of you is make sure it's labeled. So it needs to be labeled as the time it came out of refrigeration and the time it must be thrown out. Okay. The whole process, as I said earlier, you have 6 hours. All right. But again, that 6 hours is also contingent upon internal temperature not exceeding 70. So if it's a really hot day, you're not going to get 6 hours out of it. All right. So there is that. The thing is if you do it that way, there is no saving it and reheating it and using it the next day. If you are holding food without temperature control, you're using time as the only control. Then once it's reached that maximum 6 hours or internal temperature of 70, it's got to go bye-bye. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. So there are some alternatives for holding cold ready to eat foods without temperature control. For example, if it's discarded within 4 hours, the food can be allowed to reach any temperature. So the one thing you could do is you could say, okay, I'm going to hold it for 4 hours after it comes out of the refrigerator. And then you don't have to worry about if it goes over 70, it means you don't have to throw it away. It's only if you're trying to hold it for longer than 4 hours. Again, the food has to be held at 41 or below before removing it. The discard time must be 4 hours from the time it was removed from the temperature control. And the food has to be sold, served, or thrown away within 4 hours. So there is an alternative. You can do the 6, but if you want it longer, you have to make sure the internal temperature goes no higher than 70 degrees. If you are good with only doing it for 4 hours, you can let it sit and the internal temperature can go above 70, but you only have the 4 hours instead of the 6 hours. But in both instances, when you pull it from the refrigerator, it must be at 41 or below. So, like I had alluded to in previous chapters, anything produce becomes TCS when it's cut, chopped, or sliced, and hermetically sealed containers of food that become TCS when open. So this one's an interesting one. So if they are cut, chopped, or sliced, stuff that is normally TCS foods, your tomatoes, your melons, things like that. All right. If they get to a point where you end up getting them sealed. Oh, they call hermetically sealed, where there's nothing going in or out type of thing. You do have some leeway when it comes to it. However, it's one of those that you really need to be very careful about it, because the last thing we want to do is, again, run the risk of somebody getting somebody sick. So the setup for this is internal temperature has to be 70 or lower. It has to be discarded within 4 hours, and it cannot exceed 70 within a 4-hour period. And just like before, you have to discard it, you have to label it, have the discard time, and all of that fun stuff that comes along with it. So what about if you have hot food that you want to hold without temperature control? So first off, it needs to be, it originally was held at 135 or higher before removing it from temperature control. It's going to have a label specifying when the item must be thrown out, and it's sold, served, or thrown out within 4 hours. Right? So you can do hot food. So you can see in the picture, Mastacholi is the example here. It needs to be starting off at least 135. You put it out. There's no chafing dish or anything like that going on. You're just leaving it out as it is. You have a label specifying that, hey, 4 hours from the date, whatever that time is when you're pitching it. And then you have that 4 hours that it can be eaten out of before it has to be pitched. Remember, you cannot cool it and then try to use it the next day. Okay, so what happens if you're needing to get approval? So there's some places, there's going to be some health departments that are going to say, no, we don't use time as a control. It's time and temperature. Well, you might need to see about getting approval for it, almost like a variance or the regulatory approval. In order for that to happen, you've got to do your homework and you got to be proactive. And so what you're going to look at is you're going to have to put down a written procedure, how this is going to work, those critical control points, which we'll talk about in chapter 10, and how all of it comes together. You want to get written approval in advance. Don't just take somebody, if the sanitarian says, yes, that's fine, awesome, have them email it to you or have them write a letter on health department letterhead that states that you have this approval to do this holding without temperature control. Okay. Obviously, once you've got approval, you want to maintain the procedure. So whatever you wrote down, make sure you're actually doing. And then you want to make sure that the procedures are available. It's not something that's hidden away that nobody has access to except the chef. It needs to be readily available for anybody that's going to be working with the product to know how it needs to be handled, and for the health department and stuff so they can verify what you've got going on within the steps that you need to do. So let's talk now about the front of the house. All right. So looking at some different ways here. First off is how to handle dishes and glassware. So you can see the correct way as far as a plate is you don't have your thumb on the top of the plate itself. If it is barely on the edge, that's okay to create a balance. But if you hold it directly by the bottom, like it shows there, it is definitely tougher to serve. You just need to make sure it's on the edge. Don't touch the food contact areas is what you're looking at. So you can see down below, they've got their thumb right smack dab in the middle of that rim there, which is a big no-no. You can see the correct as far as glasses, a rack or a tray. So you're not directly touching those glasses, where you can see at the picture in the bottom of the dishwasher that is, stacked and somewhere under his chin, and he's got his hand on the very bottom where the food contact is as far as drinking. That's definitely not a good thing from a sanitation standpoint. When placing, you can see they're doing a setup. You're placing your silverware. You see they're handling the silverware by the handles. Handle the flatware by the handles. Do not hold the flatware by the actual contact surface. Picture at the bottom, they're actually touching the tines of the fork, which you would never do because that's a food contact surface and you're not going to bare hand a food contact surface. the bagel. You can see they used a pair of tongs to pick up that bagel. That'd be the correct way. You don't want to use your bare hands to pick that up as far as from a service standpoint. Correct way for the ice, they got the ice scoop and the ice is going into the glass. Where you can see in the bottom one, which is incorrect, they're using their hand to pick up ice and putting it into the glass itself. Again, that's bare hand contact of food. Okay. So you might come into instances where you preset your tableware, where you want to have it set ready to go early, like you might maybe set up the night before or something along those lines. If you are setting up and presetting tableware, you do need to make sure that they are wrapped or covered to prevent contamination. That's why you see a lot of it comes about where they actually have them wrapped up in the napkins themselves. So then they are protected while being set out. So table settings do not need to be wrapped or covered if extra settings are removed when guests are seated, or if left on the table, they're cleaned and sanitized after guests have left. Okay. So it's one of those that if you have a 4-top that's already set with 4 settings and only 3 are using that table, you can remove that extra place setting and you'll be okay. They don't have to be wrapped or covered. But if they are left on the table, even though they're not using them, since they are in proximity, they do need to be cleaned and sanitized, just like the rest of the utensils and such. So some basic things you should never do. But again, I know, and unfortunately, when people do this, it's usually because they're desperate, because they're trying to save money, something along those lines. But you would never reserve food returned by a guest. If the guest returns the food, it needs to go bye-bye. You're not going to turn around, replate it, and then serve it to another table. You should never reserve uncovered condiments. So if you do your ketchup in a little 2-ounce ramekin and somebody doesn't use it, you can't take it back to the kitchen and then put it on somebody else's plate. You got to get rid of it. If there's uneaten bread in the bread basket, it's got to go bye-bye. You can't take that uneaten bread and reserve it to another guest. That's just gross when you think about it, right? But again, if you're trying to save a nickel here, a dime there, sometimes common sense does not win out and desperation takes in because you're trying to save money. And then now you're playing Russian roulette with your customer's health. Any plate garnishes that don't get eaten, then those also are things you want to make sure you're pitching and not reserving. So typically unopened prepackaged foods in good condition can be reserved. So condiment packets, so if you have packets of mayonnaise, things like that, your like sugar packets and things that are on your table, those are fairly fine. Wrapped crackers or breadsticks that you have to open up individually, those are fine to reserve to a different table because they are in their own package and they have the protection from potential contamination that way. So from a kitchen staff standpoint, when it comes to serving food, some things, and again, I've talked about it already, but to reiterate, avoid bare hand contact when eating ready-to-eat foods. Either wear gloves or use some sort of other barrier like spatulas, tongs, utensils, things along those lines. Making sure your utensils are cleaned and sanitized. Ideally, you want to make sure you have a separate utensil for each food, so you're not potentially taking a chicken breast and then using that same pair of tongs to pick up some pasta or something along those lines. You potentially run the risk of some cross-contamination as a possibility. Making sure you're cleaning and sanitizing your utensils regularly. And if using them continuously, make sure you clean and sanitize them at least every 4 hours, if not more often. So when you are not using the serving utensils, make sure you either leave them in the food with the handle extended above the container rim. You don't want to end because we don't want the place where our hands are touching to actually touch the food. You could place them on a clean, sanitized food contact surface, or you can store spoons or scoops under running water or in a container of water that's at least 135 degrees. So you can do hot water and you can store them in that hot water. Now, of course, with that, you want to make sure you're changing the water, especially when the temperature drops down, to make sure that you're not doing any spread of any cross-contamination spread. If you have take-home containers, they can only be refilled when the containers are first designed for reuse. They're provided to the guest by the operation. So you actually provide them. They can't bring in their own to-go containers because you don't know how well they took care of them. And if they get sick eating your food, even though it was their container, you're still potentially liable for it. Okay. And you want to make sure that they are clean and sanitized, right? They're stored correctly so that you don't have any issues with transferring bacteria or other microbes. So take home beverage containers. So these can be refilled if the beverage is not TCS food, if the container is refilled for the same guest, and it can be effectively cleaned. All right, so those are your first three. What should be done is you need to rinse with fresh hot water before refilling. So you shouldn't just go and immediately refill a take-home beverage container. It's something that you need to make sure it's been rinsed out first with hot running water. Containers refilled by staff in the operation or by the guest using a process that prevents contamination. So if it's a self-serve, you need to make sure there is a policy set up and that your customers are aware of how they are able to refill their products. So what if you have self-service areas like buffets and things like that? First and foremost, we've seen them all of our lives. If you've been to a buffet, sneeze guards, right? Display cases to hold the food in that you have to actually open and then get the product out and then it's closed up again, or make sure it's packaged so it has built-in protection that way as well. Make sure you're using labels to identify the food items so the customers know what they are seeing there, what they are getting. So they're not trying to do something like sample and then end up doing some cross-contamination that they shouldn't be. Of course, we want to keep raw meat, fish, and poultry separate from ready-to-eat foods if they are in a self-service area, especially if you're going to like one of those, the Mongolian grills, or we used to have the place, I can't think of it right now on top of my head, the place in Peoria, where they would cook the food there for you. If you ever been to one of those, you know that they have the raw product stored separately from the ready-to-eat product or from the produce and stuff, because again, that's just a sanitation, basic when it comes to that. Keep your raw product separated from your cooked, your ready-to-eat, and products like that. If you've got a buffet, do not let customers refill dirty plates or use dirty utensils at self-service areas. That's why there's those signs that say, you must use a clean plate every time you go to the buffet, because you don't want to reuse, because you don't want to accidentally transfer germs to the tongs, ladles, spoons, or whatever that might be on the buffet. Make sure you're stocking your display with the correct utensils. Make sure you're using the right utensil for the job so it's not problematic for your customer and there potentially being contamination issues because they can't do it correctly. And like I said in chapter 8, never use ice as a food, as an ingredient, if it was also used to keep food or beverages cold. Make sure if you have bulk food in the self-serve areas that they are labeled and easy for the guests to see. It's also good to include the manufacturer or processor label with the food. You could also provide the information using a card, sign, or other labeling method. You go to hotel and they've got the bulk containers of cereal. You need to label the cereal what they are. I mean, you could guess, but it's better to not have your guests have to guess at what it is. They actually know. So making sure that if it's not in an original container, that it's properly and clearly labeled so they know what's actually in the container. So interestingly enough, a label is not needed for bulk unpackaged foods like bakery products if they meet criteria. The product makes no claims regarding health or nutrient content. There is no laws requiring the item to be labeled. The food is manufactured or prepared on the premise. The food is manufactured or prepared at another operation or processing plant owned by the same person. So it's kind of interesting, you know, if you're making bakery products, so let's say you're making donuts, right? And you're going to sell the donuts. You don't have to necessarily have them labeled if they meet these criteria, especially if you're making them on the premise. Okay. So what if you are doing some off-site service? So, and that's something that, you know, if you get into catering and stuff, that is a great revenue source. People love to have off-site catering, whether it's their home or to the park or another venue type of thing where they're not actually at your location. If you are engaging in that, some things you want to make sure you have in the back of your mind so you have these for it. First off is an insulated food grade container that's designed to keep food from mixing, leaking, and spilling. You see the example there in the top picture. Those are insulated containers to help keep that hot food hot during the transport. Make sure you're labeling the food, use by date and time, and then any reheating or service instructions if they're not already ready to go. Make sure you clean the inside of your delivery vehicles regularly so you don't have old food and nasty stuff like that there. And of course, you always want to make sure you're checking the internal food temperatures to make sure that they are at the proper temperature that they need. Don't forget about good personal hygiene. You know, I'm surprised they haven't put that in even earlier. You know, always make sure you're practicing the good personal hygiene, washing your hands, all that fun stuff. Check your internal food temperatures for off-site. If they're not being held correctly, make sure you reevaluate the length of the delivery route or the equipment if their internal food temperatures are not where they need to be. And then, of course, make sure you're storing raw products separate from ready to eat items is all some good things to be taken into consideration when you're doing off-site catering. So if you get into catering, some things you want to make sure you have in the back of mind, and this is just a brief precursor. You're actually going to take Intro to Catering as part of the program here in 217, CA 217, which will get in depth and nitty gritty and learn the ins and outs as far as catering operations. But some things you need to make sure, for example, offsite catering, you need to make sure the service site has the correct utilities. Do they have safe potable water for cooking, for dishwashing, for hand washing? Do they have garbage containers and are they stored properly? If you're doing off-site, do you have insulated containers to hold your TCS foods? You're wrapping raw meat and storing it properly. Making sure your dairy products are kept chilled, whether on a refrigerated vehicle or on ice. And again, you also have to look at what each county requires. So for example, if you want to do a temporary event, if you want to do a temporary event in Peoria County, like you want to do a cook at a fair or something like that, you are required to have mechanical refrigeration, period. You cannot chill TCS foods or ready-to-eat foods using ice. In Tazewell County, if you're doing a temporary event, let's say my organization I belong to wants to sell pork chops as a fundraiser, right? As long as the food is held correctly at 41 or below, mechanical refrigeration is not required. So I can use a cooler with ice to hold those raw pork chops as long as I'm not storing them with other non-TCS foods. Okay, so you do have to find out from those individual counties what their requirements are to make sure you're following those, just because you can't say, well, Chef Charles talked about in sanitation class and said it was okay to wrap raw meat and store it on ice. Well, yeah, but if you're doing it in Peoria County as a pork chop fundraiser outside of your kitchen, you have to have mechanical refrigeration down there in order to store those pork chops. If you're in Tazewell County, as long as it's cold, you're fine. Okay? So please make sure you're doing your due diligence with those things. Ideally, of course, you want to serve our cold food in containers on ice or in chilled containers. Of course, optional, we can use cold and hot food temperature without temperature control, according to the guidelines we talked about earlier. Making sure we're storing our ready to eat food in a separate area from raw food. And we make sure we provide customers with instructions for handling leftovers if there happens to be any of them. So if you are doing a temporary unit, it needs to make sure you keep out the dirt and the pests. So there has to be usually some sort of covering, like an easy up type of thing is usually the most common. If the place where you're doing it at, if they have like a canopy over in front of their building, that can work as well. So, those things can all play a part into it. Of course, we want to apply food safety rules to all of our food prep. We have to make sure there is safe drinking water available so we can clean, sanitize, and wash hands. And of course, we want to use single disposable items. So we're not going to be using, real plates and flatware. We're using disposable plates or the food trays or whatever we might be using, the food baskets type of thing for our customers to use. So if you're doing a mobile unit, so mobile units are your food trucks or your food trailers. So these are the ones that can, you can just pick up and go. It's usually a vehicle set up and everything. If you're looking at doing a mobile unit, you're looking at doing a food truck or something, the sanitation requirements will vary depending on what you are going to sell out of your truck. So again, work with the health department. That's the thing, is be upfront, be honest with them about what you're trying to sell. They want you to be successful. They're not trying to shut you down or not give you a permit or anything, but they want to make sure you're doing it in a way that's not going to endanger the health of the public. Okay? The same food rules apply to permanent and mobile kitchens. Okay, so please be aware of that. If you're doing a mobile kitchen, food truck, the same rules apply as to just a brick and mortar. Temporary usually will have some things like, for example, in Tazewell County, the ice as far as for cooling. If you're doing a mobile kitchen, you're going to need mechanical refrigeration for it. I mean, that's just kind of a go-to when it comes to that stuff. But again, work with the health department. You might need a special permit or a license, not only from the health department, but also from maybe the city or the county to operate if you are a mobile unit. Again, you need to make sure that you are doing your due diligence, because ignorance is no excuse. They're not going to give you a pass because, oh, I didn't know. No, what you did is you didn't do your homework. So if you're going to do a food truck or another type of mobile unit, make sure you are doing your homework, do your due diligence, and make sure that you've got all your I's dotted and T's crossed so you can operate successfully and not have to worry about the health department or the county or something like that coming to shut you down. So last but not least, vending machines. Again, for most of us, I'm assuming, or maybe even all of us here, you're probably not going to be doing vending machines, but I don't want to assume, because maybe you might get into that side of it. And if you do, that's great. But, and the thing is, as I said, this is a very broad program, and as far as the product and what you're going to be doing. So, we want to make sure we're covering all of our bases. So to keep vended food items safe, we want to check product shelf life on a daily basis. Anything past its expiration or use by date, we got to get rid of. If anything has been prepped on site and not sold within 7 days, it has to be pitched. It's a TCS food. Making sure we're keeping our food at the correct temperature, and we dispense the food in its original container, kind of like what you see there with that turkey and cheese sandwich. It was prepped and put in that container, sealed, labeled, and then it's not going to be moved from there until the customer opens it up and enjoys it themselves. Make sure you're washing and wrapping fresh fruit before putting them into the machine. So edible peels, some people will, wrap in some plastic wrap. There's some other things you can do for those. But again, if it's something you're wanting to do, fresh fruit throughout the vending machine, make sure you understand what the health department is requiring so you don't have that oops going on. So we've made it through the flow of food. We've served our customers. Everyone is happy, and it's time to reset and let's do it all again. Not really, at least not for the lecture, but that's that process that we have from intake to prep to service, and working all of that process through every single day while we're in the industry.